Welcome, everyone. I'm Bobby Duffy. I'm Director of the Policy Institute at King's College London and Chair of the Campaign for Social Science, which is part of the Academy of Social Sciences. And the Campaign for Social Science has one simple aim: to demonstrate how social sciences improve public policy, society, and our lives. And we truly believe that social science insight leads to better outcomes, and we have lots of evidence to back that up. So our role is just to highlight that value and advocate for greater use of social science in decision-making within government and elsewhere. And this event is the first of a series taking place throughout 2025 as part of the campaign's new project focused on good growth. So the project will showcase research and insight from social sciences on how the UK might best address its real and vital challenges around growth and productivity, but also how this can and should be balanced with other priorities. So it will explore whether and how the UK can achieve growth that is fair, inclusive, carefully targeted, and environmentally sustainable. And you'll be able to follow the project's development and engage with its content via a link that's going to be put into the chat shortly. So to kick us off, this is the first event in the series, and we're going to hear from a brilliant panel looking at the issue from a number of different angles. It's a real wide-ranging opener. So first we'll hear from Katherine Smith, who's Professor of Public Health Policy at the Strathclyde School of Social Work and Social Policy. Then we'll hear from Heejung Chung, who is Professor of Work and Employment at King's Business School at King's College London and Director of the Global Institute for Women's Leadership. And then from Matthew Johnson, who's Professor of Public Policy at Northumbria University. And after we've heard from the speakers, looking at all these different angles, we'll then hear from Paul Johnson, who's Director of the Institute for Fiscal Studies, to provide his response and reflections and his own thoughts on this. And then after Paul, we'll have time for Q&A. So do post your questions through the Q&A function. Do get in early in your questions and upvote the ones you like. That makes my job much easier because I will pick the ones that are most popular. So we do keep these sessions to this tight hour. People have back-to-back meetings these days, so we'll finish at 1:30 sharp. And we have loads of ideas to hear. So I'm going to go straight over to welcome Katherine first.
Thank you very much. Okay, so we were asked to address the question: how should the UK government balance its economic priority of growth and the broader need to address the UK's social inequalities? And as you can see, my answer is that the UK government should prioritise reducing the UK's social inequalities. I'm going to use my 10 minutes to explain why. I also think social scientists can do more to help, and as this is a Campaign for Social Science event, I'll close by considering how. So I come at this question from the perspective of someone who's been researching health inequalities and policy responses to these inequalities for over 20 years. And when I first began researching this topic, it was under Tony Blair's Labour government, which had a slightly odd agenda around inequalities. So reducing health inequalities was repeatedly flagged as a priority, and in England, there were quantified national targets for reducing health inequalities. Yet when it came to inequalities in wealth, Peter Mandelson was famous for saying that they didn't care about people getting filthy rich. So inequalities in wealth was not a priority, but there was a lot of policy activity to target health inequalities. And we did, over time, see a narrowing of life expectancy and infant mortality gaps. However, this success was relatively short-lived. Recent UK data not only show a widening of health inequalities, they suggest that since around 2011-2012, life expectancy has begun to decline. This graph, showing avoidable mortality rates for men, is taken from analysis by University of Glasgow colleagues as part of a recent Health Foundation review of health inequalities in Scotland. It shows that the widening of inequalities is in large part due to worsening outcomes in our most disadvantaged communities. We see this pattern especially clearly when we look at drugs deaths, an issue which particularly impacts men, and when we look at low birth weight babies. There's been a lot of analysis of what's happening and why, and one of the most recent books on this topic, Social Murder by David Walsh and Jerry McCartney, adds to a wealth of research stressing the role of austerity in worsening health inequalities. Austerity is also cited in the Health Foundation's review of health inequalities in Scotland and explored in a pre-pandemic edited book by Claire Bamborough called Health in Hard Times. So there's a lot of evidence of this link. So far, I've focused on how health inequalities vary by deprivation, but it's essential to acknowledge that health inequalities reflect intersectional inequalities. So inequalities in gender and ethnicity intersect with socioeconomic inequalities to shape health. And the extent to which minority, ethnic and racialised groups experience health disadvantages in the UK was tragically highlighted during the COVID-19 pandemic. While bar charts and line graphs provide essential information, it's in the qualitative research that we get a growing sense of how deep poverty in the UK is and of the ways in which intersectional disadvantages play out. We see repeated accounts of people who cannot get or keep a meaningful job, secure housing that is decent enough not to damage their health, eat enough food or the right food, or feed their children. We also see the damage that racism and gender-based violence inflicts. Mental health is persistently undermined in the face of these intersecting issues, and there is a higher likelihood of bereavement among friends and family, including from deaths of despair, so deaths from suicide, drugs, and alcohol. And people are often all too aware that their life circumstances are harming their health, and there's palpable anger in some exchanges, especially when discussing support systems that seem deliberately designed to be inaccessible, even fearsome. In the face of all this, it's unsurprising that people increasingly seem to believe that those in charge do not care. So we're not in a positive place in the UK right now, especially when we also consider the looming threats posed by AI, disinformation, war, and climate change. But it's important to remember that change is possible. In this forthcoming book with Claire Bamber and Julia Lynch, we look at 4 periods in which different countries, Brazil, Germany, England, and the USA, managed to reduce health inequalities. Brazil's achievements as it democratized in the 1990s and 2000s are, in my view, some of the most impressive. This graph, for example, shows the rapid decline in the infant mortality rate between 1990 and 2015, and the simultaneous reduction in health inequalities between the poorer northern regions and the richer southern regions. Looking across all 4 case studies, we identify 4 great levelers of health inequalities: welfare state expansion, improved healthcare access, reduced income inequalities, and enhanced democratic participation. Our findings suggest that we need to consider promising policy combinations rather than pinning our hopes on any specific initiatives. In addition to having historical and international examples of success, we also have growing evidence of strong public support in the UK for tackling social, economic, and health inequalities. This is evident in recent editions of the British Social Attitudes Survey and in research using other methods, including more qualitative, deliberative approaches. So I was involved in some citizens' juries back in 2016 that explored this, as well as the more recent mixed methods economic research that I've been involved in within the CIPHER consortium. But we're also faced with growing evidence of rapidly declining public trust in governments. And this is a major challenge, because if people do not trust the government, they're unlikely to support the types of policies required to reduce social inequalities. I think one of the problems is that for too long we've avoided some of the difficult conversations we need to have. An aversion to explicitly considering policy trade-offs was underlined for me when I was involved within CIPHER in research that was trying to understand how policymakers conceived and operationalised the concept of inclusive growth. It soon became clear, as these interview extracts illustrate, that this was a chameleonic concept, an idea deliberately imbued with malleable qualities that enable adaptation for contrasting audiences. This is politically useful. It means inclusive growth can operate as a coalition magnet, bringing stakeholders with very different interests and ideas together. However, it also means that inclusive growth is difficult to operationalise beyond high-level policy strategies. And once you start to dig down, the trade-offs that its mercurial qualities help obfuscate quickly resurface. In the face of major societal threats, including climate change and the rise of AI, conversations about what it means to move from a focus on average national growth to the distribution of wealth could not be more urgent. The risk of policies that promise a better life for all, when lived realities suggest the opposite for many, is that trust in governments further declines. So looking to the future, what can social scientists who want to support policy efforts to reduce health inequalities do? I've been giving this a lot of thought recently as I'm co-leading a Health Foundation funded unit which is focusing on reducing health inequalities in Scotland. We've decided to focus on trying to understand policies that impact key social determinants, so income and wealth, employability and housing. Our aim is to pay attention to the design and the implementation of policies by comparing national and local policy perspectives and lived experiences. More broadly, if social scientists are to help reduce social inequalities, my sense is that we need to move beyond analysing problems and causal pathways to focus on solutions and learning from evidence of success. Pay close attention to the implementation of policies, not just their formulation. Work across research and policy silos to help connect discussions about evidence and policy. Broaden the focus on income inequalities and consider inequalities in wealth and housing, and also explore intersectional inequalities. Pay more attention to publics, so work with communities, especially those who are more marginalised and have less political voice, and try to create spaces that bring publics, research and policy makers into conversation. And finally, I think it would do us all good to work on our communication and storytelling skills so that we can more effectively communicate the evidence that we do manage to gather. Thank you very much.
Thank you so much, Katherine. That was a brilliant opener to this, both in terms of the messages there, in terms of the interconnections between inequality, which I'm sure will be a theme of the discussions, and making it practical, actually implementing, not just analysing the problem, which is very close to the heart of the campaign in the academy. So brilliant. Thank you so much, Katherine. I'm going to go straight over to Heejung next.
Yeah, thanks. I decided to kind of focus on two things. So we're talking about inclusive growth, and I just want to first kind of support the ideas of the continuing support we need to have for kind of equality and inclusion, which I think is under threat. And then also towards the end, talk about growth, what growth means and what it should mean, and especially what the role of the state is in kind of making sustainable inclusive growth. So first of all, I think off the bat, I think it's really impossible to not talk about what's happening around the world geopolitically in terms of the attacks on kind of diversity, inclusion, and et cetera. As we see in the US, more recently in Germany, there's a lot of threat under kind of, we're seeing a divisive society. We are seeing quite a threat in terms of inclusion, where I think a lot of people are seeing a lot of this kind of issues around growth as a zero-sum game, that there's the pie is getting smaller, and if some people are getting something, then I'm not getting it. And that's true, because I think increasing number of people, and then Katherine kind of mentioned this as well, that fewer and fewer people are in jobs that are well paid, that could get themselves on a good housing ladder, housing security, financial security. And a lot of people feel like they are just missing out. And this is why we also see such a kind of a backlash, if you want, on a lot of these issues around inclusion and diversity, for example, against kind of like feminism and women's rights. And I think one of the first things we have to talk about is how to support this ideas of inclusion, given the situation that we have right now in terms of this kind of greater rise of kind of division, not only between men and women, but again, between migrants and non-migrants, old and young, as well as, of course, the rich and the rich and the poor. And actually, finally, versus the woke population versus the non-woke population. I think first what I want to say is that we need to really challenge this false narrative about this division. I think this narrative of division is actually pressed by certain politicians for their own gain, or certain media for clickbait, right? Because anger is possibly the emotion that that can really draw people to kind of keep coming back to these websites and social media. And I think one of the things we have to say is that a lot of these policies that we're talking about in terms of inclusive policies, especially in the labor market, inclusive policies, let's say in organizations, they're not necessarily for someone and putting someone, at the cost of others. And I want to give just a few examples of what I mean by that. So one of the few policies that all kind of feminist organizations and working kind of families and other kind of organizations are in support of is shared parental leave. Now, shared parental leave is essentially about putting or giving fathers more rights to spend time with their children, and it obviously helps not only support mothers back into the labor market because their share of the housework is reduced, but it also helps the child's emotional, psychological development, even cognitive development, which again helps provide benefits for the entire society. And who else does it help is fathers themselves. Obviously, we're seeing more and more fathers who want to be involved. And again, a lot of the policies that we have in terms of these inclusive policies are actually for not just a certain pocket of, let's say, a few women, but actually for the population as a whole. A couple of other ones which I want to mention was also about, like, for example, flexible working, which or the 4-day week, for example, where a lot of these are badged as something that's just for inclusiveness or that it's going against growth. But actually, if you see this, these are policies that are widely popular across the population, not just for women or mothers or people with caring responsibilities, that this is something, and again, recent Randstad survey has shown that it is even more important and seem more important than even pay levels or even job security. And I think these are things that we really need to realize, that these are policies that are not just for inclusion, but is for like inclusion of the whole population, not certain pockets of population. But also, again, and I could maybe talk about it in the later on Q&A, that there is evidence for growth and productivity for these policies as well. And the same goes for 4-day week. And again, with these both policies, it's not only just good for society, it's good for the environment. That these are policies that are really good in terms of tackling some of the biggest challenges we have in terms of, again, social division, but also in tackling the greatest challenge we have all faced, the climate change. So just finally, I just want to talk a little bit about growth, though. And I think one of the problems we have, and I continue to kind of ponder upon, is growth. What is growth and for what purpose? I think there's, and we all talk about the financialization of the economy, where making money, GDP growth is as seen as the most important thing in our society. But we know that, that the whole growth of the economy alone isn't going to be, again, inclusive, that the trickle-down theory is not working. But what is more importantly, a lot of these growth and policies that are driven for growth are actually really costly for the environment, but also for society and can actually provide a lot of social cost. So what do we need to do is to try to think about a new beverage and social contract for the greater society, to really see if we can, and I know that this seems almost impossible, to do something like the Nordic state, where we can have a bigger, broader middle class, where everybody, including working and middle class, can provide a joint solidarity into society where we could all benefit from it. And I think one of the best ways of doing this is for the public sector to have better paid, secure jobs. And these jobs actually inevitably has to be a lot in the care sector. The care sector is one of is going to be growing, it's in demand, it's going to be needed, and it can't be replaced by AI or automation. And the only reason these jobs are bad is because it has been largely relying on unpaid or low-paid women's labor. And we have been just relying on the goodwill of women to provide these services. And I think what we need to do as a society, and again, provide good and better jobs, but I think, again, as a public sector, to be that employer with, the capacity to provide these one of the most socially valuable jobs that we're all going to need and have used, and enable more workers. And again, men need to be involved in these sectors as well, to be able to provide these socially meaningful jobs, and really not look at economic growth just in the GDP growth perspective, but looking at what society, the well-being of society, going beyond just monetary terms. Okay, so I'll end there and pass it over to Matthew.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Heejung. That was great. And again, really important to bring in this. There's a false distinction between the economic dimension and cultural dimension here, and how they inevitably interrelate when you see those stresses between different parts of the population. So just before I hand over to Matt, just to say, do get your questions in, do upvote other questions, the ones that you want to see asked. But over to you, Matthew.
Thanks very much. I really appreciate being invited to this, and it's been fascinating to listen to the first two presentations. I think one way of building on those first two presentations is to think back to an example of British culture from the early 90s. One Foot in the Grave, which was a sitcom that started in 1990. And the premise of One Foot in the Grave was that this was a man and his wife who lived in a house that they owned, a detached house that they owned on the outskirts of London. that they'd been able to buy on their salaries as a security guard and a florist. And here we've got somebody dealing with retirement at the age of 60 and dealing with retirement safe in the knowledge that there will be resources coming into the house, that they'll be able to have a house that they own, that things will be predictable for them. And when I talk about one foot in the grave and its basic premise to young people today, there's a sense of bewilderment that people in jobs that would be regarded as fundamentally low paid would be able to own their home anywhere in the country, let alone in the southeast of England. But when One Foot in the Grave was broadcast, nobody wrote into the BBC to say this is ideological nonsense perpetrated on the British public by an overeager government. It was a realistic account of how people lived and how people saw their working lives. That was a clear progression from working through to family, through to property, through to all of the different things that they needed to get in their lives. And I just want to touch on something that Katherine brought up, this idea that things can change really quickly. That was a way of life that was possible by virtue of massive public investment in the wake of the Second World War. Massive public investment that was regarded as essential at the time to rebuild Britain, that involved huge infrastructural expenditure, that built hundreds of thousands of houses, that made housing affordable for people, that created a social security net, a health security net, that ensured that people's outcomes of importance to them all improved. Education, health, their family well-being, all of these different outcomes. And what we saw during the post-war consensus and in its aftermath was a society in which outcomes improved rapidly as a result of public investment. And very quickly, from the 2000s onwards, we could see the reversal of all of those trends. And what we need to understand, I think, when we're talking about growth is that the justification for growth is absolute gains. That if we liberate the market, if we liberate individuals from high taxation, they'll take decisions that best maximize the size of our economy and everyone will benefit as a consequence. And what we've seen over the course of several decades is that that simply isn't true. That if we liberate the market, one of the first cost-cutting measures is to reduce the wages, so the returns that people receive from work, to reduce working conditions, to accumulate wealth in housing and other assets that reduce supply to the rest of the population. What we've seen is that inequality which has been justified as an element of growth, has radically reduced the outcomes of importance to Britain as a society. And it's because of a commitment to these policies over decades that we've not only seen a worsening of health, economic, educational outcomes, we've seen a loss of faith in government. People no longer believe that growth produces the outcomes of importance to them. People can't see a clear pathway from work to property to family. So my response to this is that there are no cheap solutions. We need massive public investment. And it's massive public investment in infrastructure, in our health services, in our social security system that will produce the foundations upon which we can reinvigorate our society. And doing that requires us to breach one of the fundamental premises of growth, which is that there are fundamental material differences in people's interests. We cannot achieve a rebuilding of Britain without taxing wealth. There are no solutions to national renewal that don't involve taking money from the wealthiest members of society and giving it to the rest of us. So one of the things we look at in terms of developing our new beverage is reform of the social security system. We have a conditional and highly punitive social security system that's inadequate to satisfy people's basic needs, but also produces perverse incentives that reduce activity. What we think, and I was originally a skeptic, I'm a convert to basic income, is that basic income, by providing a fundamental social safety net to everybody, is the best and most effective and efficient means of providing social security that enables people to act entrepreneurially, to take risks, to avoid bad risks, and to free themselves from the kind of dominating experiences in bad workplaces, bad relationships that do some of the most horrendous forms of damage, some of which Katherine referred to earlier. And when we look at a policy like basic income, we think, on the basis of Howard Reed's and Graham Stark's microassimilation work on this, that it can produce better outcomes, more redistributive outcomes, more effectively and cheaply than those that were achieved through a variety of piecemeal measures by the new Labour government. So we think basic income is the means of targeting increases in financial security for all of those members of society which are currently facing unprecedented forms of financial insecurity. And the important thing about this is that people who are exposed to financial insecurity are in work. These are people who are exposed to grave forms of financial insecurity, to destitution, even while working full working weeks. It's no longer possible to achieve the kind of security that Victor Meldrew in One Foot in the Grave was able to achieve just by putting in the hours as a security guard. So we think this is a measure that increases not just financial security, but actually labour bargaining power. People don't have to accept the working conditions under which they currently operate. They can say no to various different things that are dangerous. They can demand an increase in wages. And it's that redistributive mechanism within work that will enable people to get back to a position of being able to support themselves, as Victor Meldrew and Margaret Meldrew were able to 35 years ago. So I think change is possible, but we need to be brave, just as the Labour government was in 1945. Persisting with the current policies is just going to be extremely damaging, and damaging to the Labour Party in particular. Thank you.
Good stuff. Thank you very much, Matthew. So final call for questions and upvoting. I'll have a look at those while we hear from Paul. Over to you, Paul. Lots to reflect on there.
Yes, plenty. Thanks ever so much, Bobby. So let me talk briefly on a couple of the themes that have come up, but I think let me start with the big thing that we're supposed to be talking about, which is growth and inequality. And of course, the problem of the last 15 years or more is we haven't had any growth. I mean, we literally had no growth, or near enough no growth, in income per capita or earnings since about 2008. And that's the first time that's happened probably for 200 years. So, growth is a really big problem. How does that relate to inequality? Well, that growth, of course, if we look at income inequality over that period, if anything, it's fallen. It's still much higher than it was in the 1970s, and the big increase in the 1980s that we saw is still mostly with us. But income inequality over that period has largely fallen a bit since 2008. And that's largely, and that's partly because wage inequality has fallen, particularly in the bottom half of the distribution. It's fallen quite a bit, big increases in the minimum wage, and because taxes have actually hit the top 5% or so much harder. The Tories, neither Tories nor Labour want to talk about this, but the last Tory government was really quite socialist in the extent to which it really hit high earners. But the big effect of this has been to crystallise the inequalities that we saw emerge during the 1980s, and in particular create what Matthew was talking about in terms of the problems between generations, and particularly inequalities in wealth. So when you've got no growth in earnings, this means that younger generations are no better off than their parents. Again, that is an extraordinary fact to quote, but it is broadly speaking true. But you've also got partly to do with much lower interest rates over much of that period, partly to do with a complete lack of house building, big increase in the cost of housing, and that wealth, of course, is focused in that older generation. So that, I mean, the home ownership among people in their 20s and early 30s roughly halved between the mid-1990s and the mid-2010s. It's actually on the way up a little bit now, and it's worth saying that the big fall in home ownership among young people happened in the 2000s, fell a little bit between 2010 and 2015. If anything, it's been rising a little bit since, but it is still much lower than it was in the mid-1990s. So what is the big change or the big increase in inequality that we've seen in recent years. It's an increase in the importance of wealth. It is not actually in the last 35 years. It's not been an increase in income inequality. So and hence it seems to me that to address that inequality that we have, growth is absolutely vital. Without growth, we are not going to be able to undo the importance of wealth. You need income to become more important relative to wealth. That is absolutely, it seems to me, fundamental to addressing this. And part of the answer actually is, in this sense, to liberate the market, which is to liberate the market in building houses by dramatically changing the planning system. That's not the only thing that is important, and it will take a long time by itself to have an effect. But our pandering to those who don't want more housing and more infrastructure has created, to some extent, some of the problems that we're facing. So that's the first sort of bucket of things that I wanted to say, which is that inequality and growth are incredibly closely linked. And one of the things that we're struggling with at the moment is the type of inequality that is created by a lack of growth. But I think it is important to be clear that income inequality and earnings inequality at the moment is certainly lower than it's been for some time, though still very much higher than pre-1980. So that's part one. Some other themes came up in what we've just heard about. One is about, I think, a crucial one, which is trust in government to do things about this. And the data that Katherine showed, I've seen all sorts of versions of this in which people will agree that there's a problem about inequality, but will also agree they don't trust the government to do anything about it. And I think that is a real challenge. There is a real lack of trust in government to do the right thing about it. It's also worth saying, though, that when people look at inequality and what the appropriate response to it is, not so many people, particularly those from lower incomes, do they think the right thing for them is for the government to give them money. On the whole, no. What they want is the opportunities in a labour market, which gives them the opportunity to earn in their own right. And again, that means getting the labour market right, getting regional policy right, having an effective minimum wage, but also potentially, but also increased productivity, a better education, and so on across the labour force is absolutely vital there. So this is not and should not be seen just as a question of redistribution. That's never going to, by itself, give you the sort of the sense of a just society that I think people are focused on. To the extent that people are simply dependent on handouts, they don't particularly like it, but secondly, I think it doesn't give you that most important element of a just society, which is one in which all people are held in equal respect, which I think is partly to do with this new social contract that Heejung was talking about. I think that is absolutely crucial. I'm taking a couple of the other specific things that people have talked about. Health inequalities, it strikes me, are the final outcome, really, of all of the other inequalities in society. And I think that's some of what Katherine was really illustrating, by all of those things going into the degree of health inequality that we face. And I think it's extremely hard to tackle health inequalities as health inequalities without tackling all of those other things, which is why a lot of the reports one sees on health inequalities do end up recommending really quite dramatic changes to a great deal of what happens in society. And it is depressingly the case that over recent years we have seen increases, particularly among poorer groups, in unnecessary deaths and worse health. It's also on health, the immediate problem, of course, facing the government is this absolutely staggering, I mean staggering increase in numbers of people claiming health-related benefits, a literal doubling in the number of people being awarded disability benefits each month relative to 3 or 4 years ago. By the end of this decade, we will be spending £100 billion a year on health-related benefits, which will be something like, which will be an absolutely enormous increase over a decade. That is both a social disaster, it's an economic disaster, and it's a fiscal disaster. And dealing with that is clearly going to have to be absolutely at the top of the agenda. The last thing I'll do, I'm afraid, is to I think is just to gently disagree with Matthew about the role of a basic income. That is something that hasn't happened anywhere in the world ever, and yet has been talked about for decades, if not centuries. And there's a reason for that, which is that to pay a basic income at a level that you can sensibly live on is just far too expensive. It would mean moving our tax burden from its highest level ever, where it is now, to a level probably a third higher still. And I think that is almost well, it's certainly inconceivable in real world politics at the moment. I think we need to look at all sorts of aspects of the way that the welfare system works at the moment. What it does is it gives you very little money if you're unemployed and out of work. One of the reasons that the disability benefit system looks more attractive, it gives you a big incentive to move into part-time work, but then a very little incentive to move from part-time into full-time work, and that is reflected in what we see in terms of how people have responded. We need to deal. We absolutely need to deal with the way that works. There's so much more that I could talk about. Heejung talked about inequalities between the genders, which I think is partly is driven to a large extent by the way that our labour market, well, obviously by the way our labour market works, but part-time work is very poorly rewarded relative to full-time work. And you get almost no benefit from part-time work in terms of future increases in your earnings. In terms of its impact on your later earnings, it's pretty similar to not being in work at all. So there's something really problematic about the way that part-time work seems to work within our labour market. It is also worth saying that in terms of some other inequalities, inequalities between people from different ethnic backgrounds, for example, in education, huge strides in the UK. We're probably the best of the developed nations in terms of how well most ethnic minorities now do in the education system. But still, that's not reflected in how well they're doing in work. Same true, of course, of women who do far better in education and then earn less when they graduate. So those are all issues that we need to deal with, and also issues which are important in understanding how to get growth going. But let me end where I started, which is to say that growth and inequality are absolutely fundamentally linked. If we don't get growth, we're not going to deal with the absolutely, in my view, most important social inequalities in terms of social mobility and generational inequality. Because with no growth, the thing that matters most to you as an individual is who your parents are. That is pretty much the most important determinant of your outcome later on. Until you get growth, that will remain. And so growth, it seems to me, is absolutely the fundamental necessary. It's at least a necessary part of any efforts to tackle inequality.
Brilliant. Thank you so much, Paul, for that. And we've had some brilliant questions come in, but I was just going to give the panel a chance to come back on anything from Paul, Matthew on UBI, or just really brief, because I do want to get 2 or 3 great questions in from the audience. But Matthew or anyone else on the panel, any reflections on Paul's thoughts?
Thanks very much, Paul. And I think this is a well-rehearsed position on basic income, and the response to it, our response to it is that all of the solutions that are presented in terms of increasing wages, increasing the various different outcomes of importance to people, are either extremely expensive in and of themselves, take decades to achieve, or are just inadequate and have been proven to be inadequate. And we've seen the justification for growth raised over decades as a means of increasing wages and providing people with an opportunity to get on in life. But we've seen that the policies presented to do that, to achieve that, have just failed. And liberating the housing market may in some ways increase access to housing, but it doesn't address the long-term problems with low pay that you yourself have highlighted, that really are critical to our society. What basic income does is to remove welfare as an out-group issue for people in work. So it protects workers, it protects people who are in work, it gives people that capacity to develop enterprises within their communities where they're needed most. And what we see in terms of public support for it is that actually, just like the furlough scheme, people see it as a popular means of addressing the insecurity that they face urgently. No other policies have been presented which have been able to do that in the same way. So we think it is actually, it's both feasible and it's popular.
Thanks.
Can I just come back on I think Paul made lots of really great points, and I just wanted to pick up on that kind of inactivity, and it pays better to be on inactivity than to work. And I think that's actually a big problem, because one is about our kind of social security system. It is a flat rate based and tax based rather than social insurance. And we could probably talk about that. But I think one of the other things is that one of the reasons people are going that is because the quality of jobs are bad. Bad jobs are making people sick, and people can't go into work because the job qualities are really bad. And it's kind of interesting how we don't try to change the job, but try to change people, because people are not the problem. It's the jobs, and the jobs are going to keep, like, if you're not changing the job, the working conditions, and the model in which that we consider what a good worker looks like, we're never going to be able to change any of those problems unless we completely reform the welfare state.
Very good. And that relates to some of the questions that we're going to come to as well. Anything, Katherine, just to be fair to the whole panel?
Yeah, so I'm just going to link across those 2 points. So I think universal basic income is a really interesting policy idea. Obviously, it can be designed in lots of different ways, but 2 of the things it doesn't seem to address are inequalities in existing wealth, but also the meaning that people get from jobs, which comes out very strongly in the qualitative literature, the importance that having a kind of meaningful role in society is. So I think if we are going to go down a road of exploring universal basic income, and I think it's definitely an area where we should be investing research to explore the potential, especially in the context of AI and the role of AI in reducing jobs. I think we also need to be looking at how we can change society to ensure that people have that sense of having a meaningful role, a meaningful stake in society, something that some jobs give people. Certainly my job gives me that, and we see it in a lot of qualitative research, people talking about that. If you don't have that, then how else are people going to feel part of society? So that feels an important part of that conversation.
Thank you, Katherine. So we've got 15 minutes left, and I'm going to try and get through 2 or 3 questions, brilliant questions again from the audience. And the first one, actually, Jenna Randall has said there is a value system underpinning our economic system whereby social status and what's considered a good job, I think there's a missing word, are not those roles of caring domestic or reproductive labour, usually performed by women, migrants and other marginalised identities. Is it possible to change narratives so that basic healthcare, education, caring, funding, and given the importance they deserve as a bedrock of our society, which is a issue close to my work on generational thinking and a future for men's place in the workplace. But Heejung, you've got
yes.
keen on this one.
Very, very keen. And because that's kind of what I was ending on. And I think, okay, so the value system, and the reason why they're paid badly is because it has been historically done by women unpaid. And even now, it has been just undercut. So the value really kind of links up with the amount of pay that they're getting. And if you see other countries, such as, and again, I keep saying the Northern, European countries, but sometimes now in East Asia as well, that if you pay these jobs well, that the value that they're given is also going to increase as well. And I think this is where the state could really come in. And, I'm not going to talk too much about the financing, but I think the financing will come because it has like an additive value where if you provide really good quality jobs in care sector, then people will be able to access those care, and those people will then benefit from it and being able to take part in the labor market. So you're generating tax revenue through those good paying jobs, but also you're generating tax revenues through the people who are able to benefit from it, because a lot of people are in inactivity because of all the caring rules for childcare, for informal care, but also self-care. So again, this is a real good circular economy that we can generate. And again, and really improve the standing of, as you say, the bedrock of our society, which is care, and make sure that care is a good quality job. And then you know what's going to happen? We're going to see more and more young men taking part in these jobs as well.
Right. Anyone else on that theme? I think I saw you unmuting, Paul, but maybe.
Yeah,
Katherine. Yeah, Katherine.
Yeah, I really agree with what Heejung's just said, but I also want to say, some research I was doing with young people, that it was really clear that the COVID-19 pandemic and the emphasis on frontline workers was starting to change people's narratives around which jobs were most valuable. It feels like that's a really important foundation for having this kind of conversation that we need to have. And I think the two things go hand in hand, right? It totally agree with the point that if you pay people more, then those jobs will seem more valuable. But also, if people are focusing on the value of certain jobs, there's more willingness to pay more for those jobs. So the two things are kind of interactive.
Oh, Matthew, anything on that?
I was going to say, I mean, the private sector's first step in as soon as it's liberated is to reduce labor costs, and many of these jobs, caring jobs, nursing, were extremely highly valued when they were well paid and socially valued before the reforms of the 1980s. So I think these are jobs that can only become well paid again when the state intervenes. Only the state is able to preserve a higher rate of pay for these sorts of professions, and to imbue them with the value that I think they ought to be imbued with. The point about basic income in this context is that it gives people the capacity to leave demeaning working environments, and giving people the capacity to leave actually increases their power within their employment, and increases the bargaining power such that pay increases with it. So it's a mechanism by which to force the private sector to pay more as well. So that's my response, I think, on this, that basic income helps rather than undermines better jobs.
Can I just briefly add on that? So if the public sector, so if the state provides really good quality, well-paid, good working condition jobs in the care sector, and as well as the other kind of public sectors, such as public servants, what's going to happen is that's going to drive the private sector as well. And we've seen this for many, many empirical studies. So whatever you do in the public sector, it provides a framework of changes in terms of the kind of level, what people expect. And that actually shapes not just the public sector jobs and the values, but also the private sector as well.
Cool.
So a few thoughts on this. There's a difference between social value and how much people are paid. It's always going to be the case that some people are paid more than others, and that doesn't necessarily reflect how we think about social value. So it's really important that we have, as people have been saying, a narrative or a society or a social contract which means that people are appropriately respected and valued, irrespective, really, of how much they earn. That seems to be a different question, or it's a related question. It's a different question to how one sets pay and how one rewards people. Now, clearly, the biggest thing that we have done in this area in the last 2 or 3 decades is to introduce the minimum wage and turn that into the national living wage at levels which, 25 years ago, I think would have been inconceivable. We've now got one of the highest minimum wages in the world relative to average earnings. And that at one level, that's been incredibly successful. There's little or no evidence that it's had a significant impact in terms of increasing unemployment. What it has done is really squeeze that earnings distribution in the bottom half of earnings and significantly reduce differentials between people at the bottom and people a little bit of the way up. That has caused some disruption and difficulties for employers, but it's certainly helped people on the lowest earnings, including in places like the care sector and so on. In terms of those sorts of earnings, nurses and care sector workers and so on, and broadly speaking, women in general are clearly paid a lot more now relative to the average than they were 40 years ago. Again, we look at the sort of 1980s as a period of big disruption in terms of big increases in inequality, and we think about inequality being much higher now than it was in the 1970s. That's true across the distribution. It's not true between men and women. Women are in a vastly better position in the labour market now, still nowhere near good enough, but vastly better than they were in the 1970s. People from ethnic minorities in a vastly better position than they were in the 1970s. So we shouldn't look back to that as a period of perfection in terms of inequality. It was a very, very long way from that if you're thinking about anything other really than the vertical distribution across everybody. And then, of course, there is a choice. If we're talking about care workers, social workers, teachers, nurses, whatever, that is a choice that we make through what we pay through the public sector, and we could get into the cost clearly of increasing that, but it's certainly the case that over the last 15 years or so, many public sector workers have done less well than those in the private, even less well than those in the private sector.
Great stuff. So I'm going to do something cheeky and demanding of you. Just for this final round, there's 3 questions that I'd like us to cover, and we'll just go through in speaker order, and you don't have to cover all of them because we've only got probably a minute or so each. But the 3 that I'd come top and really interesting thoughts in kind of reverse order from very specific is one is about a tax system currently favouring assets over work. What tax interventions in the current system can be introduced to rebalance and fund necessary public investment? So I think wealth taxation, which has come up in the discussion, comes up a lot. It'd be great to get thoughts on that from anyone who feels able to. Then the second question is more about the narrative. So one of the reasons the current political narrative has been so effective is because of how well it connects to emotions and biases. How can we recraft arguments being made that connect to the real life experiences of those who back politicians with their votes and amplify social media messaging so prevalent in our society? So it's more about how do we connect the storytelling point. And then finally, I'd be interested in the panel's reflections on the concept of good growth. Is good growth an oxymoron, particularly touching on equity and sustainability? Can there be growth without inequality and destruction of the planet? So those are 3 questions: wealth taxation, storytelling and connecting, and is good growth possible, I guess, as a final reflection. So I'll come to Katherine. I'll come in order. Katherine first, just a minute or so.
Okay, I'll be really quick. So yeah, I think we do need to think about different ways of taxing, and I think one of the things we really need to look at is wealth that lies in property ownership and land ownership. On the question about narrative, so I really agree with this and was trying to make this point in my presentation. Ben Phillips has written a great book called How to Fight Inequality, where he reflects on the fact that people concerned with inequalities tend to focus on numbers and tend not to like to get into conversations about emotions or think about the craft of storytelling. And he's encouraging us to do that. I very much think that's right. If we're going to influence policy and publics, we need to get better at that craft. We need to engage with people's emotions. I also think we need to create deliberative spaces that bring policy, public and research conversations together. And then on good growth, I don't think it's an oxymoron. I think you can have good growth that's better than the growth that we've had that is fairer, but I don't think good growth in itself deals with some of the issues we've been discussing, like inequalities in wealth.
Perfect. That was really great. Thank you, Katherine. Heejung.
Yeah, so I'm not going to just go into too much details on everything. With tax, I guess one of the things would be capital gains tax that we could be considered. About the arguments and the narrative, I think there needs to be a bit more narrative about how we're trying to, like, we are listening to a larger population, that there are lots of people who feel like they're being left behind. And I think, again, as Katherine says, there's a lot of emotions and there's a lot of kind of stories that are not being told. And I guess that's deliberate forms and other ones are good. In terms of growth, I think it's just about this. Is it economic growth? Because that's all we're looking at. I mean, this is so much of an emphasis and we've been talking about it for such a long time. But what is growth and what kind of growth do we want to see and how, and really talk about, and increasingly now we're talking about social value and environmental cost and social cost of these growth. And only through then can we really talk about it, because growth can be a whole range of things, but it doesn't necessarily have to be just monetary economic growth, which is, again, being, and then we know, like, it's really centered on the few.
Great. Thank you so much, Heejung. And Matthew.
Thanks. So we think tax on wealth is absolutely essential. So we would introduce a progressive annual wealth tax on household wealth above 2 million quid, beginning at 2% and increasing. And that would raise 43 billion quid after allowance for avoidance per annum. Would establish a carbon tax of around 55 to 60 quid per tonne, which would raise about 13 billion in current prices. We'd introduce a tax on frequent flyers and private jets, which would bring in 4.5 billion. We'd reverse fuel duties, the freeze on fuel duty, which would raise 20 billion, and we'd introduce a proportional property tax, which would raise about 9 billion. Well, more important than all of that, probably we'd remove some of the largest and unnecessary or badly targeted tax reliefs, which would raise 74 billion per annum. Really quickly, by tackling wealth, you can massively increase the tax yield to the country. And we think if we do that, you can massively reduce the inequality of wealth that affects Britain and reduces its growth. And if that's consistent with an increase in people's spending power, and the economy improves as a consequence, increases as a consequence, then that's grand. But it's that concern with spending power and reducing financial insecurity that's most important.
Thank you so much. And finally, Paul.
Yeah, so two things. On the question, is good growth an oxymoron? No. I think, I mean, whatever the opposite of an oxymoron is, I wouldn't say that any growth is good, but my goodness, we need growth. And if we don't have growth, then particularly the generational inequality will grow, and we will be stuck with the most appalling level of social mobility. I absolutely think you can have good growth and growth that is that is equalizing, and we know that growth is entirely consistent with our climate change desires. We've cut our, at least on a production basis, our carbon emissions by more than 50% whilst growing since 1990. Climate Change Committee today has shown how we can get to net zero. I mean, one can quibble with it, but all of that is entirely consistent with growth. So I, to be honest, have no truck. In fact, it's not, I don't just have no truck with those who are anti-growth on any of these bases. I'm actually incredibly angry with them, because with no growth, we just have social disaster and dislocation. And it's fine if you're sort of okay at the moment, but if you're low paid and don't have much wealth at the moment, the only thing that's going to get you out of that is significant growth. On the tax and wealth, there are lots of problems with our tax system at the moment as it taxes wealth. We've got a ridiculously regressive council tax system, for example, so we need to sort out the taxation of housing. Our inheritance tax system is very ineffective. But I would say, yesterday I had the I gave a lecture to the National Farmers Union annual conference, and my goodness, they are not happy about a modest change to inheritance tax on them, which still leaves them far better treated than anybody else by inheritance tax. It's very hard to get political agreement to taxes on wealth which we might think are appropriate. And I have to say, in response to what Matthew has said, there is not even remotely that level of income available from increasing wealth taxes in that way. No country, again, in the world has ever achieved that. There are certainly things that we could do, but to suggest that this is a way of raising hundreds of billions that can sort everything out, I think is a chimera.
Great. Well, thank you so much. We've gone just 1 minute over. We've done really covered an incredible amount of ground in that tight hour. Thank you so much. Before I give my final thanks, I just wanted to say, do check out the website for future events and increasing content on the Good Growth Hub for the campaign for social science. So just left for me to say thank you to everyone for coming, to the team at the Campaign for Social Science for organising all this, and of course to our brilliant panel. Thank you all and see you soon.